Welcome back. Tonight, we slip behind the gilded walls of St. Peter's and ask, are these dark rituals still performed in the Vatican? For centuries, faith and ceremony have intertwined in a tapestry of light and shadow-soaring choirs and hidden chants, incense rising in prayer, and, once upon a time, whispered rites in secret chambers. We won't romanticize the past. Beneath the marble beauty lay fears and power plays as old as Rome itself. Yet there is wonder here, too, in the devotion, the music, the breathtaking art that frames every moment of worship. If these history-deep explorations speak to you, please like and subscribe, but only if you truly connect with our journey. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Dim the lights. Let a soft hum settle in the air. And join me as we step into a world both luminous and mysterious. For as long as memory reaches back, ritual has guided human hearts toward the divine, and nowhere is that more evident than in the Vatican's centuries-old liturgy. Incense, for example, curls upward in Catholic worship today, just as it once did in the Jewish Temple of Jerusalem, where sacred burners filled the sanctuary with frankincense and myrrh as early as the 6th century before Christ. Those aromatic traditions passed into Rome, where pagan priests offered fragrant smoke to deities like Jupiter and Venus. By the 4th century of our era, when Christianity became the empire's official faith under Emperor Constantine, church leaders consciously adopted familiar rite scandals, vestments, processions to ease the transition for new converts. Over ensuing centuries, the rituals evolved and were codified at councils such as Trent in the mid-1500s, yet the shape of those ancient ceremonies remains. Today, the Vatican's Mass still opens with the priest censing the altar and congregation, a symbolic act of purification whose origins trace back 3 millennia. Chalices, too, carry hidden meanings. The gold and silver cups may evoke vessels from Roman mystery cults, and their form echoes Greco-Roman designs used in Dionysian festivals. Even the layout of the altar pushed forward to face worshippers after Vatican II in the 1960s rests upon patterns established by early church architects who drew on classical temples. In such ways, the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica conceals layers of borrowed practice, an inheritance both beautiful and unsettling. Beneath the gleaming marble sits the weight of history's shadows, reminding us that every gesture we see today once spoke to gods older than Christianity itself. In every subtle gesture of the Eucharist, layers of history converge to create a ceremony both familiar and mysterious. The act of lifting the consecrated bread and wine above the altar took shape in the 11th century under Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, who around 1078 insisted that the faithful see the real presence of Christ. That moment echoes ancient Greek and Roman libations when priests poured wine to honor deities such as Dionysus or Zeus, raising the cup in blessing before the assembled crowd. A century later, in 1264, Pope Urban IV established the Feast of Corpus Christi to celebrate the Eucharist with solemn processions through city streets rituals, reminiscent of pagan harvest festivals, in which communities paraded symbols of fertility and gratitude. Even the sign of the cross, now made by millions every day, can be traced to early Christians of the 3rd century who used it as a secret sign during periods of persecution. echoing earlier mystery cults that marked initiates with sacred symbols. By the time the Council of Trent formalized the Roman Rite in the mid-16th century, these gestures had already absorbed centuries of borrowed meaning. The chalice's elevation, the reverent kneeling, the silent adoration of the hostal testify to a lineage that reaches back through late antiquity into the rituals of Rome's pagan temples and the sanctuary practices of ancient Jerusalem. When modern Catholics approach the altar today, they inherit this complex tapestry. Each movement feels timeless because it is drawn from a wellspring of human yearning for connection with the divinia yearning that has always mingled light and shadow. There is a moment in the Latin Requiem Mass when the phrase Dies irae, dies illa reverberates through soaring Gregorian chanthet, haunting summons of judgment and fire. Composed in the 13th century, most likely by Thomas of Celano around 1250, the Dies irae entered liturgical use by the end of the same century and became central to funeral rites across Europe. Its vivid verses describe the final day of wrath when the trumpet will sound, the dead shall rise, and humanity faces divine reckoning. Yet beneath its sacred purpose lie echoes of earlier death hymns, such as the ancient Roman trope sung at funerals for departed emperors, and even distant affinities with Mithraic rituals that celebrated the soul's passage through cosmic trials. By the time Pope Pius V published the Tridentine Missal in 1570, Dies irae had been fully assimilated into the official Roman rite. It persisted through Baroque settings by composers like Mozart and Berlioz, whose wildly dramatic requiem masses ensured that the chant's dark poetry reached concert halls as well as cathedrals. In 1969, after Vatican II sought to simplify liturgy, the Dies irae was removed from the standard funeral mass, though it remains optional and endures in artistic works to this day. When modern worshippers hear its swelling melody, they tap into 8 centuries of ritualized mourning and anticipation of the Last Judgment. In that moment, beauty and terror stand side by side, reminding the faithful that liturgy can summon the deepest human fears, even as it offers the promise of mercy. The moment when the priest invites the congregation to behold the Lamb of God carries with it an intensity that most worshippers feel but rarely question. This invitation, formerly known as the Agnus Dei, was introduced into the Mass during the 6th century, attributed to Pope Sergius I around 687. Its language invokes imagery of sacrifice that stretches back to ancient Jewish Passover lamb rituals, where the blood of a spotless lamb spared households from plague, as recounted in Exodus. Early Christians reinterpreted that symbol in light of Christ's death, writing in the New Testament that Jesus was the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. By the time the medieval theologian Peter Lombard compiled his sentences in the 12th century, the Eucharist's sacrificial dimension had become central to Catholic doctrine. The prayers framing the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine echo temple sacrifices performed in Jerusalem before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D. Those rituals involved the slaughter of animals and the offering of their blood before the altar, a practice condemned by some early church fathers, yet never entirely erased from liturgical memory. When later councils, such as the Fourth Lateran in 1215, and Trent in 1545, affirmed transubstantiation, and the idea that the bread and wine truly become Christ's body and blood. They cemented Eucharistic sacrifice as a cornerstone of worship. Today, as the host is lifted high for all to see, worshippers kneel in silent awe, not merely recalling a past event but partaking in it. That fusion of ancient sacrifice and living ritual underscores the profound tension between life and death, mercy and judgment, that runs through every Mass. In the quiet hush before Mass begins, priests don vestments that seem at first like mere ceremonial attire, but in truth carry centuries of coded meaning. The alb, a simple white garment, traces its lineage back to the tunica alba worn by Roman citizens during solemn occasions in the 1st century. Over time, this plain robe became a canvas for embroidered crosses and trim, evolving into the priestly garb we see today. By the early medieval period, around the 8th century, clergy had added colored stoles and maniples that symbolized virtue, penance, or the liturgical season. At the Council of Tours in 567, bishops commanded that clergy wear distinctive garments to set themselves apart from the laity, hearkening back to Roman pagan priests who wore special robes during rites to Jupiter or Cybele. The chasuble, the outermost vestment, descended from the Roman painula cloak of the 3rd century, but was gradually reshaped to frame the altar as a living icon of Christ's sacrifice. In the 13th century, scholastic theologians began to interpret each color violet for penance, white for joy, red for martyrdomas, a spiritual code tied to biblical events. Even today, when a priest adjusts his cincture or crosses himself while slipping into an amice, he participates in a ritual wardrobe whose stitches bind modern practice to ancient symbolism. This unbroken thread reminds us that every piece of cloth worn at St. Peter's carries within it a tapestry of human faith, doubt, and the desire to bridge heaven and earth through the language of fabric and form. In the stillness before the liturgy begins, a censer swings gently, releasing tendrils of smoke that curl toward the vaulted ceiling. Incense has perfumed sacred spaces since at least the 16th century before Christ, when ancient Mesopotamian priests burned resins as offerings to their gods. By the 1st century, Roman temples dedicated to Cybele and Dionysus still relied on fragrant smoke to bridge the gap between earth and sky. Early Christians inherited this sensibility, weaving incense into rites by the 3rd century as a symbol of prayer rising to heaven. The manual, known as the Sacramentary of Gelasius, compiled around 494 AD, prescribes when and where to cense the altar and the congregation, a practice later reaffirmed at the Carolingian reform of the 9th century under Charlemagne. Despite changing editions of the Roman Missal, the ritual of incense survived reforms by Popes Pius V and Pius XII, and endures after Vatican II, though sometimes in optional settings. When modern worshippers inhale its warming aroma, they touch a moment that links them to the Jewish Temple of Jerusalem, where priests burned frankincense before the Holy of Holies, and to medieval cathedrals where thurifers paced solemnly beneath stained glass. Each wisp of smoke enacts a silent offering, sanctifying both space and soul, even as it conceals mysteries in its pale mist. Through its simple ascent, incense reminds us that ceremonial fragrance can carry both hopeful devotion and an echo of ancient rites, stirring reflection on the timeless human impulse to seek the divine through all the senses. Beyond the grand nave of St. Peter's Basilica, lie narrow corridors and side chapels, seldom visited by the faithful, their quiet walls bearing witness to centuries of private devotion and whispered rites. One such space, the Madonna della Colonna Chapel, was consecrated in 1616 and houses an ancient icon said to weep Tirsan artifact, moved here under Pope Gregory XV to temper public fervor during times of plague. Elsewhere, the Corsini Chapel, built in the 18th century for Cardinal Neri Corsini, contains frescoes depicting the mystical visions of Saint Andrew Corsini, portraying angels and demons in an intimate battle for a soul's salvation. These chapels, though open for prayer, often serve as venues for rites reserved to select clergy, special votive masses, private benedictions, and intercessory prayers for souls in purgatory. Records from the apostolic camera note that cloistered liturgies occurred here as early as the 16th century, when access to the Pope himself was restricted to a handful of officials and trusted advisors. In these hidden corners, the scent of centuries-old incense lingers in dusty niches, and the flicker of votive candles animates statues of saints whose miraculous intercessions were once the subject of urgent petitions. Though Vatican II encouraged greater transparency in worship, it did not abolish the right of a pope or cardinal to celebrate private masses behind closed doors. Today, subtle door plates marked Sacristia Privata still bar the way to rooms where vestments are prepared for the pontiff, and where the hush of preparation gives way only to the soft murmur of prayers. Stepping into these hidden chapels, one senses the weight of countless unspoken petitions and the enduring conviction that even the most private act of faith can shape the destiny of souls. Beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's lies a network of tombs and vaults that few ever glimpse. Yet these subterranean chambers have borne witness to pivotal moments in church history. The Vatican grottos, first excavated in the mid-19th century by Pope Pius IX, revealed a tangle of tombs dating back to Constantine's 4th century basilica and even earlier necropolises. Among these silent corridors stands the tomb of the popes, where nearly 100 pontiffs rest in simple sarcophagi, their names engraved in fading Latin. In the dim light, legends persist that certain high ceremonies were once conducted here. Far from the glare of public worship rituals of consecration and secret oaths, binding newly elected cardinals to vows of absolute discretion, archival entries from the year 1606 hint at special masses held in the crypt beneath the Confessio, the site believed to contain St. Peter's own burial bed. There, the Pope's vestments would be blessed by close aids alone, an act that reinforced the sacred link between Peter's successor and the apostle himself. Even after the lengthy renovations under Pope John XXIII in the early 1960s, the Vatican retains permissions for private liturgies in these ancient vaults. Walking among the narrow passages, one feels the hush of centuries and the weight of unspoken prayers echoing against limestone walls. It is a place where the boundary between earthly power and spiritual mystery seems most thin, a reminder that beneath the cathedral's soaring dome lies a world of hidden rites and enduring faith. Hidden among the Vatican's vast collections lies a treasure trove of manuscripts that stretch far beyond the familiar pages of Scripture. The Vatican Library, formally established by Pope Nicholas V in 1451, boasts over 75 zero codices, many penned centuries before the Renaissance. Within its climate-controlled vaults rest texts in Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac psalm, so fragile that only a handful of scholars are ever granted access. Among these are apocryphal gospels that never made the biblical canon, treatises on celestial magic by medieval monks, and alchemical recipes attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. In 1587, under Pope Sixtus V, the library's catalogers began to classify these works, secretly designating a restricted section for volumes deemed too potent or controversial for general circulation. Though modern reforms under Pope Paul VI in the 1960s opened many archives to researchers, certain codices remain locked behind iron-barred doors, their seals broken only in the presence of a prefect and the Pope's personal librarian. Rumors of occult knowledge hidden in these texts have inspired legends of Vatican sorcerers wielding arcane power. But most scholars agree the manuscripts reflect the intellectual curiosity of bygone eras rather than evidence of dark rites. Still, when a solitary reader carefully turns the yellowed pages by candlelight, one cannot help but wonder what whispers of ancient wisdom lie in the margins. The weight of those vellum leaves presses on the imagination, reminding us that even within the heart of the Church's most august institution, mysteries endure teasing us with the promise of revelations just out of reach. Long before exorcism captured popular imagination, the Church formalized rites to confront what it called unclean spirits. References to expelling demons appear in the Gospels of Mark and Luke, where Christ commands dark forces to flee, but it was not until the 16th century that the Vatican codified a standardized ritual. In 1614, Pope Paul V authorized the Rituale Romanum, a manual drawn up under Cardinal Bellarmine that detailed prayers, gestures, and sacramental holy water, relic fragments, and the sign of the cross, specifically for exorcism. This rite followed precedents from ancient Jewish purifications described in Leviticus, and even echoed pagan practices in which spirit chasers used incantations and sacred water to cleanse temples. While the Rituale remained largely unchanged through revisions by Innocent XI in 1673, and again under Leo XIII in 1890, the Second Vatican Council encouraged a greater pastoral approach, emphasizing spiritual accompaniment over sensational spectacle. Today, the Vatican's International Association of Exorcists operates with the Church's blessing, training priests in a course that can last up to 3 years and requires episcopal approval. When an exorcist confronts a case, he follows centuries-old formulas, prayers drawn from Leo XIII's prayer to Saint Michael, the sprinkling of exorcised water, and liturgical psalms recited in Latiniac element, a thread in an unbroken chain reaching back to early Christian rites. Though modern Catholics may view such practices with skepticism, the persistence of this ritual underscores the enduring belief that the spiritual realm can intrude upon earthly life and that the Church stands ready, armed with ancient words of power, to restore the balance between light and darkness. The Rituale Romanum, first promulgated by Pope Paul V in 1614, stands as the Church's definitive handbook for a wide array of sacred ceremonies, from blessings of water and objects to the solemn exorcism, rites reserved for dire circumstances. Compiled under the guidance of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, The ritual book organized prayers and rubrics into a single volume, replacing earlier scattered manuscripts that dated back to the Carolingian reforms of the 9th century. Its sections meticulously prescribe every posture, every incantation, and every use of sacramentals such as holy oil, consecrated salt, and blessed palms, ensuring uniformity throughout Catholic realms. When Pope Innocent XI ordered a revision in 1673, he emphasized clarifying the exorcism rites without altering the theological foundations laid out in the Council of Trent's decrees from 1545 to 1563. A later revision, under Pope Leo XIII in 1890, introduced prayers invoking the intercession of Saint Michael the Archangel, reflecting the 1884 vision in which Leo believed he heard winds of diabolical forces stirring the Church. Despite later liturgical overhauls in the wake of Vatican II, which simplified many ceremonies, the Rituale Romanum remains authoritative for bishop-approved exorcisms and select blessings. It also governs foundational rites such as the dedication of churches established by Pope Sixtus V in 1586, and the solemn blessing of holy oils used in baptism and confirmation rituals that conserve sacramental theology, formulated as early as the 4th century by figures like St. Ambrose. When a priest opens the weathered pages of the Rituale Romanum today, he touches more than a liturgical text. He engages with a living tradition that has shaped Catholic spirituality for over 400 years, uniting clergy across continents in ceremonies that reach back through history to Christ's earliest disciples. Deep within Vatican walls, certain rites unfold in the company of only a select few, binding participants through whispered oaths and shared solemnity. Records from the 16th century describe the creation of the Conclave as a ritualized election, during which cardinals sequester themselves behind locked doors, swearing to absolute secrecy under pain of excommunication. This practice emerged after the deadly schism of 1268, 1271, when prolonged papal elections left Rome leaderless and cardinals in disarray. In response, Pope Gregory X's Second Council of Lyons in 1274 imposed strict regulations, including the cutting off of servants and limiting food supplies to hasten consensus. Over the centuries, the conclave's protocols became ever more intricate. The donning of the white cassock is reserved for only the newly elected pontiff, while the rest remain in cardinalatial scarlet, each colored stitch a silent testament to duty. Beyond the papal election, secretive rites persisted in the Roman Curia, such as the private blessing of the fisherman's ring and the vesting of the papal tiara ceremonies, so closely held that only the dean of the College of Cardinals and a handful of prelates may attend. According to archival inventories, these private blessings incorporate prayers drawn from the Rituale Romanum, alongside gestural accretions dating back to medieval coronations of secular monarchs. Even today, while the world witnesses white smoke rising from the Sistine Chapel chimney, the actual passage of the fisherman's ring, and the insertion of the blessed papal ring onto the new pope's finger occur behind thick curtains, unseen by all but a privileged few. Such tightly controlled rituals underscore the Church's enduring commitment to both continuity and mystery, ensuring that in moments of supreme transition, power remains enshrouded in the sacred. When the smoke from burning ballots spirals skyward above the Sistine Chapel, the world pauses in anticipation. Yet those wisps of white or black conceal layers of symbolism refined over centuries. The practice of secreting cardinals into the chapel began under Pope Gregory X after the protracted election of Clement IV in 1268, but the use of smoke signals dates only to the 15th century. Initially, cardinal electors burned their ballots in an outdoor hearth, and news spread by courier. In 1484, under Pope Innocent VIII, the election moved indoors for security, and ballots were fed into a metal chimney installed in 1492 by Pope Alexander VI. To distinguish the outcome, damp straw was later added black smoke for no decision, straw plus ballots for white smoke upon successful election. Though Vatican II revised many procedures, the essential mechanism endures. Each morning and evening, a thurifer places the ballots in a small bronze brazier, igniting them with charcoal preserved from the prior burn. The red-heated coals imbue the smoke with a purplish hue, a subtle nod to the cardinal's scarlet robes, and the resulting color invites debate. Is it black, gray, or white? Once consensus crystallizes and the new pope's name is announced, a second fire burns the acceptance formula, producing brighter white smoke. Meanwhile, a bell tolls from the campanile as a second signal, reinforcing the visual message. This orchestrated interplay of fire, smoke, and sound combines practical necessity with centuries of ritual evolution, ensuring both secrecy and celebration. When that first plume of white smoke drifts above Rome, it marks not only a new papacy, but a living tradition that traces back through medieval conclaves to the very heart of the Church's most sacred ceremonies. The scarlet robes of the cardinal are more than a display of ecclesiastical rank. They are a living symbol woven from strands of history, theology, and solemn promise. When Pope Innocent IV formalized the College of Cardinals in 1254, he granted them distinctive attire to mark their unique role as papal advisors and electors. By the 15th century, red had emerged as the color of martyrdom, chosen to remind cardinals that they must be willing to shed their blood for the faith. The fabric itself follows traditions set by medieval courts, where vibrant dyes signified power and prestige. Early dye recipes called for kermes and cochineal insects imported along Mediterranean trade routes, making the crimson hue both rare and costly, a fitting visual for those closest to the seat of Peter. During the solemn ceremonies of the papal conclave, cardinals appear in full scarlet, but the precise shade has shifted over time. A darker cardinal crimson was decreed by Pope Pius X in the early 20th century to distinguish it from the brighter scarlet worn by monarchs and knights. Each stitch and pleat adheres to rubrics laid down in the Ceremoniale Episcoporum of 1600, ensuring uniformity across centuries and continents. Beneath the elegant folds lies a rugged reminder of the weight carried by those who don the red hat, the call to counsel the Pope, administer the universal Church, and, if necessary, embrace martyrdom rather than betray conscience. Every time a cardinal lifts his zucchetto or drapes a mozzetta over his shoulders, he enacts a silent vow rooted in medieval solemnity, bridging his present service with the sacrifices of countless predecessors who walked the corridors of power in Rome. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. subscribed to keep uncovering what's hidden. From their founding in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola under the papal bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, the Society of Jesus has inspired both admiration and suspicion for its intense discipline and secretive structure. Jesuits take 4 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and a special vow of loyalty to the Pope in matters of mission. This 4th vow, unique among religious orders, obliges Jesuits to accept any mission the pontiff deems necessary an oath that fueled rumors of clandestine agendas and unquestioning loyalty. By the end of the 16th century, Protestant polemicists accused Jesuits of drafting secret constitutions that bound members to serve papal political aims. Allegations dramatized in satirical pamphlets and in the Black Legend, narratives that painted Spain's empire in moral shadow. Yet, most historians agree the order's internal Formula of the Institute, penned by Loyola in 1550, laid out transparent rules for obedience without any hint of occult ceremony. Still, opponents spread stories of midnight assemblies in candlelit cloisters where Jesuits pledged absolute silence and concealed their true loyalties. In reality, their spiritual exercise, a rigorous program of meditation and discernment completed over 30 daysar conducted in silence, but focus on personal reflection, not secret rituals. During the 30 Years' War, Jesuits served as confessors and advisors at courts across Europe, their influence prompting rulers to whisper of hidden counsels and coded gestures. These rumors reached a fever pitch in 1738, when Pope Clement XII briefly suppressed the order in Portugal under pressure from political rivals, only to be restored a decade later by Pope Benedict XIV. Today, while the Society of Jesus remains active in education and missionary work, its vow of special obedience continues to stir intrigue. When Jesuits renew their vows each Pentecost, they reaffirm centuries of commitment to serve the Church a practice both transparent in its liturgy and often misunderstood in the court of public imagination. The Renaissance was an age of curiosity, when scholars in papal service often pursued fields that modern eyes would label occult. Yet, for them, chemistry and astrology were integral paths to understanding creation. Within Vatican walls during the 16th and 17th centuries, clerics such as Giovanni Battista della Porta and Athanasius Kircher conducted experiments on mineral transmutation and celestial influence, blending religious conviction with natural philosophy. Della Porta, who corresponded with members of the Curia, wrote extensively on the virtues of plants and metals, advocating for alchemical methods that promised medicinal breakthroughs while maintaining that true transmutation required divine favor. Kircher, who arrived in Rome in 1634 as a Jesuit polymath, filled rooms of the Roman college with devices he believed could reveal hidden forces in nature, from magnetism to the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. His publications suggested that spiritual and material worlds intersected through symbolic correspondences, a view inherited from medieval mystics rather than courtly sorcerers. While the Inquisition scrutinized some of these investigations, occasionally seizing manuscripts thought to contain heretical content, the majority of research remained under the Vatican's aegis, shielded by the patronage of popes who prized innovation in the service of faith. By the late 17th century, interest in alchemy waned as chemical science emerged. Yet the imprint of those early laboratories endured in botanical gardens and anatomical theaters supported by the Church. Today, historians examining Vatican archives find recipe volumes for tinctures and notes on planetary alignments jotted in margins of theological treatises. These annotations reveal not nefarious rites, but a sincere quest to reconcile observation with doctrine, to discern God's hand in the microcosm of matter as well as in the macrocosm of the heavens. In that spirit, alchemical whispers echo still through the stone corridors of the Vatican, reminding us that the boundary between science and mystery has always been porous. Tucked away in lesser-seen corners of Vatican City stand chapels and crypts, whose walls are carved with scenes that defy easy explanation. One of the most enigmatic sites is the Santo Stefano degli Abyssini, built in the 8th century for Ethiopian pilgrims. Its walls adorned with intricate reliefs, combining Christian iconography and geometric patterns reminiscent of Coptic art. Nearby, the Braccio Nuovo Museum houses fragments from Nero's Golden House portions of frescoes and marble reliefs that once decorated a pagan palace. Some scholars argue these works were repurposed in Renaissance chapels to evoke continuity with Rome's imperial past. Yet others detect in their stylized foliage and intertwined beasts a coded language of transformation known to medieval guilds. In the underground crypt of the Vatican's old St. John the Baptist Church, uncovered in 1931 during excavations, archaeologists found graffiti-like incisions beneath layers of plaster symbols resembling the Eye of Providence and alchemical emblems that may date to the 13th century. Though official Vatican guides describe these as early Christian marks of faith, conspiracy theorists have long speculated they record secret knowledge passed among initiates. Historical documents, however, point to a more mundane origin. Pilgrims and sacristans carving devotional signs to mark miraculous events or record weather patterns for agricultural prayers. Yet the persistence of these carvings in hidden spaces suggests that, across centuries, individuals sought to leave personalized, imprincelant testimonies of belief, fear, and wonder. Wandering through these vaults, one encounters more questions than answers. Who etched these shapes, and to what purpose? Are they protective wards, votive offerings, or the last breaths of rites now lost to time? As daylight fades and electric lighting illuminates the worn stone, the crypt feels alive with whispers of the past, inviting us to trace our fingertips over vanished rituals and consider how every mark, however small, might once have opened a doorway between the sacred and the unknown. Hidden in plain sight on the rear doors of the Vatican's Apostolic Palace are small iron studs arranged in intricate patterns that at first glance appear purely decorative. Yet art historians and archivists working in the Sala delle Udienze confirm these studs date back to the early 15th century, installed during the pontificate of Pope Martin V following the end of the Western Schism. Their arrangement echoes medieval sigils used to ward off evila practice, rooted in Byzantine and early Christian inscriptions that invoke angels as protectors. In the crypt beneath the palace, a single fragment of parchment discovered in 1902 bears witness to the original intention, a brief Latin prayer asking for divine guardianship over the papal chambers. Over time, the visible protective emblem gave way to more overt symbols. Clergy memoirs from the 17th century record that Pope Urban VIII commissioned a similar ward at the entrance to the secret archive, where apostolic letters and political dispatches were stored. While Vatican archivists today maintain that these iron studs represent a continuity of faith rather than a cult practice, the overlap of symbol and ceremony points to a deeper spiritual psychology. Physical marks carved into stone or metal to draw heavenly power into sacred spaces. During renovations under Pope Pius XI in the 1920s, some studs were relocated, but the original patterns were meticulously preserved, underscoring their perceived importance. For modern visitors, these small metal points might pass unnoticed. Yet, they serve as mute sentinels, a tangible reminder that for centuries the Vatican has blended art, architecture, and prayerful intent to create barriers against unseen dangers. In that fusion of geometry and devotion, the boundary between monument and talisman grows porous, inviting us to ponder how even the smallest details can carry the weight of belief. Relics of saints have long drawn pilgrims to the Vatican, yet beyond public veneration lies a network of traditions surrounding their use for purposes that extend beyond visible devotion. The first catalogue of Vatican relics appears in a registry compiled under Pope Innocent III in the early 13th century, listing fragments of bone, cloth, and wood housed in the sacristy of St. Peter's. These sacred objects, beyond their role as tangible links to holy figures, were also employed in blessings believed to confer protection or healing. For instance, apocryphal accounts from the 15th century describe a piece of Saint Clement's bone being placed beneath the threshold of the Scala Sancta to guard against plague. By the 16th century, during Pope Sixtus V's reorganization of the Church's assets, relics were sometimes transported in silver reliquaries for clandestine processions aimed at averting famine or war, as evident in entries of the Vatican treasury. While modern practice restricts relic veneration to approved liturgical settings, the tradition of using these remains in private blessings persists. Priests may slip a fragment of a martyr's bone into a prayer book for travelers, or envelop a piece of cloth said to have touched a saint's tomb around the wrists of ailing faithful. Such uses are governed by canons established at the Council of Trent, which prohibited the sale of relics, yet permitted their exchange for legitimate liturgical needs. Today, scholars examining the Vatican archives find detailed instructions on properly handling and verifying relic authenticity, including chemical analyses initiated under Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century. When a relic is retrieved from its vault and held aloft in silence, it carries with it centuries of both public faith and private appeal, binding the visible beauty of veneration to the quieter hopes and fears that drive believers to seek supernatural aid. High above the nave, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling unfolds a tapestry of Genesis scenes that dazzles millions each year. Yet among its frescoes lie subtle images that have sparked debate over hidden ritual significance. Painted between 1508 and 1512 at the commission of Pope Julius II, the central panels depict the creation, the fall, and the promise of salvation, all framed by ignude male figures whose poses seem to guide the viewer's gaze toward divine mysteries. In particular, the small lunettes featuring Sibyl's pagan prophetesses, such as the Delphic and Cumaean Sibyl, reflect Renaissance humanists' fascination with classical prophecy and the convergence of pagan wisdom with Christian revelation. Though officially celebrated as artistic genius, contemporaneous letters from Cardinal Bibbiena hint that Julius II intended the Sibyl's inclusion to symbolize the Church's claim to universal truth, a coded assertion of papal authority in a Europe fractured by schism. Additionally, marginal, grotesque hybrid creatures painted along the lunettes draw on motifs from ancient Roman wall decorations uncovered during excavations of Emperor Nero's Golden House. Some art historians suggest these figures served as protective masks, echoing medieval apotropaic designs meant to ward off evil. When cardinals held private devotions beneath the ceiling in the early 17th century, as recorded in the recently discovered Barberini archives, they would stand beneath these sibyls and grotesques, interpreting the imagery as divine guardians of their prayers. Though Vatican guides today emphasize the theological themes, the layered interplay of classical and Christian iconography underscores how artistic ritual could communicate esoteric messages to those in the know. Standing beneath that painted sky, one senses that Michelangelo's brush, guided by theological counsel and humanist counsel alike, inscribed more than scripture on plaster. He embedded a dialogue between faith and hidden wisdom that continues to intrigue viewers 5 centuries on. For centuries, whispers have circulated that papal elections carry more than procedural formality, that an unseen hand guides the choice of a new pope. Such rumors gained traction after the deadly election of Gregory XI in 1378, which led to the Western Schism, yet the idea of a sacred curse shaping outcomes predates even that crisis. An anonymous tract from 1314, discovered in the Vatican's secret archive, recounts how cardinals, believing supernatural forces at play, performed penitential rites and fasting during conclaves to ward off diabolical influence. By the time Pope Innocent XII formalized conclave rules in 1692, requiring cardinals to swear oaths of secrecy and purity before entering the Sistine Chapel, the notion of spiritual interference had become deeply woven into the ritual. During the 18th century, several conclaves saw sudden deaths among electors, fueling superstitions that malevolent spirits were bent on preventing swift consensus. Pope Pius IX, in 1846, ordered priests stationed outside the chapel to recite the Litany of Loreto continuously, a precaution meant to shield proceedings from unseen disruption. Though modern conclave protocols emphasize transparency and security bulletinations on smoke color, guards in modern uniforms, the ancient fear of cursed ballots persists in anecdotes told by Vatican insiders. When a cardinal falls ill during the voting, older members sometimes pause to recite verses from Psalm 23, invoking the Lord's rod and staff as defenses against spiritual malice. These practices, while unofficial, underscore the conclave's gravity. It is not merely a political process, but a sacred encounter where divine and human choices intersect. As white smoke finally signals agreement, the collective relief may be as much for a rite successfully completed as for the lifting of a centuries-old anxiety that this decision, above all others, remains protected from darkness. Throughout the medieval era, the line between saint and sorcerer was sometimes blurred, as church leaders grappled with practices that drew on astrology, herbal lore, and elemental magic. One notable example is the 12th century Bishop Robert of Hereford, whose treatise on the medicinal properties of plants reflects both theological caution and a pragmatic embrace of natural remedies steeped in folk tradition. His writings, discovered in a Vatican manuscript dated around 1180, reference the use of mandrake root to soften the heart and mugwort to ward off nightmares remedies that straddled the boundary between healing and enchantment. As universities such as the University of Paris rose to prominence in the 13th century, scholastics like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas debated the legality of such practices. Albert defended the study of natural philosophy, while Aquinas condemned any invocation of spirits outside divine sanction. In parallel, records show that certain late medieval papal physicians in Rome maintained herb gardens within convent enclosures, borrowing techniques from Islamic scholars to blend pharmacology with prayer. These gardens, catalogued in a 15th century inventory under Pope Nicholas V, grew mandrake, hellebore, and vervain plants, long associated with both cures and curses. When the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century codified stricter definitions of heresy, it condemned the superstitious use of charms, yet retained allowances for approved medicinal applications. Even as the Inquisition targeted folk healers accused of dabbling in dark arts, church-appointed experts preserved monastic apothecaries, ensuring continuity in sacred healing. Today, botanists and theologians studying medieval herbals in the Vatican's medicinal plant collection recognize the subtle interplay of faith and folklore, a reminder that in the shadowy world of early science, the quest to heal often led practitioners to the threshold of the mystical. In the annals of Vatican lore, no figure captures the imagination quite like the Black Pope, a title attributed to the superior general of the Jesuit order because his position ostensibly eclipses even that of cardinals. Though never an official church term, Black Pope dates to the late 16th century when critics of the Society of Jesus decried its rapid rise under Pope Paul III's 1,540 bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae. The nickname draws on the general's customary black cassock, contrasting with the scarlet robes of cardinals. By the mid-17th century, anti-Jesuit pamphleteers in Protestant Europe wove conspiracies that the Jesuit superior wielded covert papal power, issuing secret directives in candlelit meetings within the Collegio Romano. Internal Jesuit archives, carefully preserved in Rome, since the order opened its first novitiate in 1541, reveal no evidence of occult bonding rituals. Instead, they detail the spiritual exercises, daily meditations, and discernments devised by Ignatius of Loyola in 1522 to deepen personal relationship with God. Still, the aura of secrecy surrounding Jesuit governance restricted access to leadership councils, the fourth vow of special obedience to the Pope, and the order's prowess in education fed persistent suspicions. When Pope Clement XIV suppressed the society in 1773 under political pressure, rumors of clandestine rituals only intensified, though nearly 2 decades later, in 1814, Pope Pius VII restored the order without conditions. Modern Jesuit leadership publishes its constitutions and invitations to meet your Jesuit in open houses worldwide, yet the moniker Black Pope endures in popular culture as shorthand for hidden influence. In truth, the superior general's authority lies not in covert ceremonies, but in guiding a global network of educators, missionaries, and scholars, a mission carried out through dialogue rather than clandestine pacts. Even so, the enduring legend reminds us how mystery and misunderstanding can shroud even the most transparent of institutions, giving rise to stories that endure long after the facts have been laid bare. In the shadows of papal power, prophecies have swirled like incense smoke, promising both salvation and doom. As early as the 3rd century, Christians recorded visions of apocalypse in texts later deemed apocryphal, but it was during the tumult of the 10th and 11th centuries that whispered predictions took on political force. The monk Adso of Montier-en-Der wrote of a last pope who would preside over the Church's final trials, a tale amplified in the Liber Pontificalis and repeated in Vatican annals. During the Avignon papacy in the 14th century, fear of a waning divine mandate led to secret consultations among curial advisors who commissioned astrologers to calculate ominous alignments portending the end times. In 1513, the mystic friar Girolamo Savonarola preached fiery sermons in Florence, predicting the fall of corrupt leaders, and though he never met a pope in person, his followers sent coded letters to Rome that circulated among select cardinals. These letters, preserved in the Vatican secret archive under seal until the 20th century, reveal attempts to interpret solar and lunar eclipses as divine omens directed at the Church's hierarchy. While the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, condemned private prophecy not sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority, it did not extinguish the urge to foresee God's plan. Even Popes Pius IX and Leo XIII, faced with political upheaval and modernist challenges, convened commissions to assess reports of apparitions and prophetic dreams reported among clergy. Today, the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture studies such phenomena with academic rigor, distinguishing folklore from faith. Yet the persistent allure of whispered prophecies read in antique manuscripts or murmured in cloisters remains a testament to humanity's yearning to glimpse the future, especially in times when history itself seems poised on the brink of transformation. In the dim acoustics of Gothic chapels, the repetitive strains of plainchant converge on trance induction, drawing congregations into a shared spiritual resonance that some medieval mystics described as bordering on the numinous. Gregorian chant, standardized under Pope Gregory I around 600 AD, sought to unify worship across Christendom, yet its evolution incorporated folk melodies from Celtic and Germanic regions. By the 11th century, the monastic schools at Solesmes in France meticulously preserved pneumatic notation, ensuring that the ethereal beauty of chant resisted secular influences. Despite this sacred lineage, critics from the 13th century onward, notably the philosopher Peter Abelard, cautioned against the emotional power of music, warning that it could override doctrinal clarity and lead worshippers into excessive devotion. Still, when a choir intones the Kyrie or Veni Creator, the disciplines of rhythm and melody converge with the architecture of vaulted ceilings to create an otherworldly cathedral of sound. In private papal chapels, such as those in the Apostolic Palace, select choirs would perform antiphons after midnight, their voices weaving through corridors that once echoed with the footsteps of Innocent III. Vatican accounts from the 17th century record that Cardinal Barberini commissioned special polyphonic settings of the Agnus Dei to be sung for newly elected popes, a musical rite that fused ceremonial pomp with intimate invocation. Even after Vatican II simplified liturgical music and permitted vernacular hymns, many cathedrals retained chant for its perceived ability to lift hearts beyond the mundane. Today, when a thurifer stands at the chapel door and intones the ancient melody, the chant carries listeners beyond the text into a ritual space where sound itself becomes sacrament. In that sacred echo, the boundary between prayer and performance dissolves, reminding us that the power of music has always walked hand in hand with the mysteries of faith. Along the grand thresholds of St. Peter's, where pilgrims pause to steady their hearts before entering, legend tells of solemn oaths sworn in candlelit alcoves at the moment of passage. These crossroads pacts, as chroniclers termed them in the 15th century, were reputed agreements between medieval pilgrims and local confraternities, binding travelers to charitable service upon their return home. Vatican notaries of the era recorded charitable pledges etched on parchment rolls, sealed with wax, and placed beneath threshold stones as symbolic deposits of intention. While most pilgrims sought indulgences or safe passage, extant documents reveal that some confraternities required deeper commitment scare for the poor, ransom of captives, or defense of church property. These pledges often carried personal prayers to patron saints such as Saint Christopher or Saint Roch, invoked for protection against plague. In the early 16th century, Pope Leo X formalized indulgence grants for such acts, inadvertently encouraging more elaborate promises at pilgrimage crossroads. Though later church reforms, particularly after Trent, discouraged private agreements that skirted ecclesiastical oversight, the practice persisted in rural chapels, where local brotherhoods maintained their own registers of vows. Even as modern security and liturgical protocols brought greater order to Vatican precincts, the underlying impulse remained. Crossings between sacred spaces and ordinary life marked moments of spiritual contract. When a traveler today slips a coin into the offering box before passing beneath Gian Lorenzo Bernini's colonnade, there echoes an ancient desire to anchor faith in tangible commitment. In that silent exchange, the boundary between visitor and devotee blurs, reminding us that every journey to the heart of the Church can become a personal covenant, carried long after the stones of Rome recede into memory. Brotherhoods devoted to Saint Sebastian and Saint Agatha thrived in Renaissance Rome, their members bound by oaths sealed with shared cups of wine and splashes of consecrated water. Known as the Misericordia confraternities, these groups emerged in the 14th century to care for plague victims, bury the dead, and ransom captives of Barbary pirates. To symbolize their unity and purpose, members would gather beneath frescoed loggias in the Vatican's Borgo district, dipping their palms into a common chalice of blessed wine and tracing the sign of the cross on each other's foreheads. Archival entries from 1476 describe a ritual in which novices drank from the communal vessel 3 times once for faith, once for hope, and once for charity before swearing to treat all in need as brothers and sisters. Over the next 2 centuries, the drinking cup evolved into a silver vessel engraved with scenes of mercy, still preserved in the Vatican Museum's collection. Though the Council of Trent forbade confraternities from performing unsupervised liturgies, it did not abolish these communal rites of solidarity. Instead, the Church sanctioned them as lay expressions of Catholic piety, integrating their charitable works into official parish initiatives. Even during Pope Urban VIII's attempts to centralize charitable functions under the Apostolic Chamber in the 17th century, local confraternities retained their ritual cup ceremonies as reminders of their founding vows. Today, when members of modern Roman lay associations gather to renew their commitments, they often reenact a simplified form of the ritual, touching a shared glass of water blessed by a priest. In that gesture, they invoke centuries of compassion and communal service testament to a time when shared cups forged both spiritual and social bonds that transcended class and creed, reminding us that mercy itself can be a sacrament enacted through simple human fellowship. Under the cover of darkness, cloaked figures bearing candles have, for centuries, wound their way through the Vatican's outer precincts in solemn procession. These midnight walks trace back to Good Friday observances of the early medieval period, when Roman Christians reenacted Christ's journey to Calvary. By the 9th century, such processions had become formalized. Participants donned penitential robes and walked barefoot along the ancient Via Papalis. Pausing at 13, marked Stations of the Cross, newly carved into basilica walls. Documentation in the Lateran archives. From 862 records Pope Nicholas I, accompanying pilgrims on foot, bearing a single torch to symbolize the lone light of faith amid darkness. Over time, processional orders multiplied, some led by confraternities, others by university students seeking atonement. By the 13th century, these nocturnal rites incorporated chants of the Stabat Mater and the Tantum Ergo, melodies borrowed from monastic vigils held at dawn. In the High Renaissance, Pope Paul III revived the practice to console a city devastated by plague, instructing clergy to lead nightly marches around the Leonine Wall, bearing relics of saints interred in nearby churches. Though Vatican II discouraged elaborate public penances, it did nothing to suppress private midnight processions held within Vatican City by religious orders on feast days. Today, a small contingent of Swiss guards and Vatican gendarmes quietly clear paths of tourists as friars and seminarians process in candlelit silence, stopping at altars set up in seldom-seen vestibules. Each flicker of flame illuminates centuries of communal sorrow and hopeful longing, creating a living bridge between penitents of past and present. In that hush, where footsteps echo off ancient stones, participants carry forward a tradition that transforms the darkest hours into a luminous testament of faith, solidarity, and the enduring power of ritual to bind community in shared remembrance. Hidden beneath the basilica's trembling foundations lies the Confessio, the underground chapel that enshrines what tradition holds to be St. Peter's tomb. In 1599, under Pope Clement VIII, Masons carefully excavated this revered chamber, discovering a simple red-vaulted crypt marked by ancient tiles and the remains of early Christian worshippers. Within this shadow-filled space, popes and select clergy have conducted private liturgies for centuries, invoking St. Peter's intercession in the Church's gravest moments. According to Vatican ceremonial guides from the mid-17th century, newly elected pontiffs once descended here before their first public blessing, laying hands upon a low altar directly above the apostles' supposed sarcophagus, reciting prayers drawn from the ancient ceremonial of Pope Victor I in the late 2nd century. These rites, described in the unpublished diary of Monsignor Cesare Rossetti, circa 1654, bound the Pope in personal solidarity with his predecessor, symbolically transferring Peter's pastoral authority. During the sack of Rome in 1527, when marauding troops threatened the city, Pope Clement VII sheltered in this subterranean shrine, conducting whispered masses by candlelight to bolster his beleaguered guards. Though Vatican II reforms simplified papal inaugurations, the tradition of descending into the confessio for a moment of solitary prayer remains, conducted now in near darkness by the Pope's chamberlain and one master of ceremonies. Standing there, mere inches above the rock believed to hold St. Peter's bones, the pontiff renews his vow to shepherd the faithful a silent ritual that speaks louder than any procession above. In that deep hush, where the marble floor gives way to living rock, the boundary between mortal and divine feels most delicate, reminding both pope and priest that their authority springs from a legacy laid in grave and honored stone. In the hushed chambers of Vatican ceremonial, Latin serves not only as the language of worship, but sometimes as a cloak for prayers too sacred for everyday ears. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, specific antiphons and orations were designated for secret masses, private services held by the Pope or high-ranking prelates. Unlike the sung Mass heard by the faithful, these celebrations employed a specialized set of collects and psalms drawn from manuscripts like the Pontificale Romanum, compiled under Pope Gregory I in the 6th century and refined by Popes Sergius I and Innocent I in later centuries. Among these prayers is the Oratio Super Oblata, whose complex syntax and rare vocabulary reflect theological nuances debated at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. Only a handful of priests, sworn to absolute confidentiality, were permitted to recite Aitit's lines, invoking the mysteries of the Trinity in terms that even many Latin scholars find elusive. Another example is the Collecta Secretissima, first recorded in a 1625 ceremonial rubric under Urban VIII, which petitions for divine protection over hidden ecclesiastical deliberations. These secret collects were whispered in low voices, often barely audible above the scent of incense. When Pope Pius IX celebrated private votive masses in the Vatican's private chapel during times of political upheaval in the mid-19th century, he employed these prayers to seek heavenly counsel away from prying eyes. Though the post-Vatican II liturgical reforms abolished the distinction between public and secret Mass, many of these ancient collects survive in private breviaries and in the prefatory pages of the current Roman ritual, annotated but seldom used. When truly whispered in solitude, these archaic prayers evoke a lineage of intrigue and devotion, a reminder that even within the transparent structures of modern liturgy, some words remain reserved for the deepest mysteries of faith. In sacred rites of anointing, perfumed oils have carried both healing and hierarchy from ancient times into the heart of Vatican ceremony. The tradition traces back to Old Testament practices described in Exodus and Leviticus, where priests anointed altars and holy objects with olive oil mixed with myrrh and cinnamon. By the 4th century, church fathers like Athanasius praised holy oil as a conduit of the Holy Spirit, and the first recorded consecration of chrism oil mixed with balsam for baptisms and confirmations appears in a 5th century Roman liturgy. Under Pope Gregory the Great around 600 AD, the mixture of oil, balsam, and sometimes even flower essences was standardized for episcopal consecrations. In the pontificate of Pope Innocent III in the early 13th century, inventories meticulously recorded balsam imports from the eastern Mediterranean, reflecting both ecclesial and commercial networks. During the coronation of Emperor Charles V in 1530 at Bologna, Vatican sources note that 3 distinct oil catechumens, chrism, and oil of the sick were used in separate rites within the Sistine Chapel, each anointed with precise prayers from the Pontificale Romanum. Though the Second Vatican Council simplified some sacramental rites, it reaffirmed the essential role of sacred oils, insisting they be blessed by the bishop during the Chrism Mass in Holy Weekend annual tradition preserved since at least the 9th century. Today, when a priest dips his thumb into the fragrant chrism to mark the forehead of a newly baptized child, he connects to an unbroken chain stretching back to Solomon's temple. Each drop carries a legacy of devotion and authority, sensory bridge between the earthly and the divine, where scent becomes sacrament and touch becomes mystery. Beneath the soaring pilasters and intricately carved cornices of St. Peter's Basilica lies a hidden order of geometry, guiding both form and function. Renaissance architects like Bramante and Michelangelo drew upon Vitruvian principles rooted in Roman and Greek treatisesto, imbue every space with harmonious ratios. The basilica's nave spans exactly 100 Roman feet in width, a measure first inscribed in imperial forums, while the dome's hemispherical curvature echoes the celestial womb of the Pantheon, consecrated under Hadrian in 126 AD. In medieval cathedrals, builders employed simple pegs and cords to lay out glyphic crosses and compass circles, traditions that Vatican masons preserved in sketches held in the fabric of St. Peter Archive. These plans contain not only structural dimensions, but hidden alignments. The Chapel of the Madonna, for instance, sits along an axis that points toward the spring equinox Sunrisian echo of pagan temple design, intended to mark sacred time. During the symposia of the Accademia di San Luca in the 16th century, theologians debated whether such geometry revealed God's perfect mind or merely human ingenuity. Yet the inclusion of star motifs in marble floors and the subtle tilt of columns toward Jerusalem suggest an intentional marriage of math and mystery. When pilgrims traverse the basilica's labyrinthine aisles, they unknowingly participate in a journey mapped by numbers older than Christianity itself. In that interplay of stone and proportion, architecture becomes ritualic, step measured, each gaze framed, reminding us that beauty and belief have long drawn strength from the same immutable laws of creation. Throughout Vatican ceremony, the Pope's keys serve as powerful symbols that both unlock literal doors and open portals to sacred authority. The crossed keys, fashioned from gilded bronze, first appeared on papal seals in the early 12th century under Pope Calixtus II, recalling Christ's words to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." These emblems sewn gold, one silver represents spiritual and temporal power, and they adorn everything from the pontifical coat of arms to the ornate handles of chapel doors. In the secretive Rite of the Fisherman's Ring, performed only once per pontificate, the Cardinal Dean presents the keys to the newly elected Pope as part of a private blessing. Archival notes from 1628 record that during this ceremony, the cardinal intones a prayer invoking St. Peter's intercession before placing the silver key into the Pope's left hand and the gold into his right. Those same keys are used in the 1595 dedication of the Clementine Chapel, when the Pope formally unlocks its bronze door after the final blessing, symbolizing the opening of new spiritual realms to the faithful. Even the layout of keyholes in the papal apartments reflects canonical precision. Each door bears a unique ward pattern that corresponds to a specific ritual functionsome unlock vesting rooms. Others admit only those sworn to secrecy into private oratories. When modern papal attendants hand the master keyring to the pontiff each morning, it is more than a practical gesture. It is a living connection to centuries of apostolic succession. In that moment, the humble act of turning a key recapitulates history. Peter's authority passed down through ages, encoded in metal and ritual. Each click against ancient lock and tumblers, shaped by artisans of the Renaissance, resonates with the promise that the Church's doors remain open, yet guarded, under the watchful guidance of those who hold the keys. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. Even as the Vatican has embraced transparency in many liturgical matters, whispers persist about rites that hover on the edge of official acknowledgement ceremonies, never spoken of in guidebooks, yet woven into the Church's living tradition. Among these is the informal blessing of new Vatican employees, a ritual handed down orally rather than through any published rite. Early 20th century diaries of Swiss Guard recruits mention an unlisted patronus prayer recited by the commanding officer on the eve of their first watch, invoking Saint Maurice as protector against unseen threats. Though no written rubric survives, veterans recall the prayer's essential elements: a quiet gathering before dawn in a chapel off Borgo Santo Spirito, the lighting of 3 candles, and the silent laying on of hands accompanied by a psalm verse whispered in Latin. Church historians speculate this rite evolved from medieval guild ceremonies, where new members were formally accepted into trade brotherhoods through oaths and symbolic gestures. When Pope Pius XI reorganized Vatican security services in the 1920s, he reportedly allowed the continuation of this blessing to foster esprit de corps among the guards. Modern Swiss guards, sworn to defend the pontiff with their lives, still undergo a brief private commissioning that includes a fragment of the ancient prayer, recited in low tones by a chaplain. Though the Vatican's official manuals make no mention of it, the rite endures, passed from chaplain to chaplain and from guard to guard, a reminder that the Church's most guarded traditions often live in memory rather than in print. In that quiet moment before dawn, when the flicker of candlelight illuminates sacramental gray walls, participants acknowledge that some blessings like faith itself must be received in silence. In the mid-20th century, an extraordinary claim emerged from the halls of the Vatican that a device called the chronovisor could peer into history itself. The story centers on Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a Benedictine monk and musicologist who in the 1950s purportedly collaborated with scientists at the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences. According to Ernetti's later accounts, the chronovisor consisted of a console with dials, screens, and horn-shaped receivers. By tuning to specific temporal frequencies, its operators allegedly glimpsed events such as the crucifixion of Christ and speeches by Cicero. Critics point out that no official Vatican record exists to corroborate these experiments, and that Ernetti's notebooks, never produced publicly, remain locked away in private archives. Skeptics suggest the story draws on genuine wartime research into electronic eavesdropping and early television technology, which during World War II had been pursued in secret by several European governments. Yet for believers, the chronovisor legend taps into centuries of ritualized yearning for divine revelation. In Catholic tradition, relics and visionary experiences have long served as windows into the sacred past-think of St. Bridget's visions of Christ's wounds in the 14th century, or the revelations recorded by Sister Faustina in the 20th century. Whether Ernetti's machine was a hoax, an elaborate thought experiment, or a genuine prototype, its myth endures because it echoes deep human hopes. To witness history firsthand and to bridge the gap between temporal flesh and eternal truth. In the silence of Vatican libraries, where esoteric texts gather dust, the chronovisor's tale reminds us that the line between science, faith, and fantasy has always been as thin as a veil. Long before modern notions of psychological warfare, the Inquisition's tribunals wielded procedures that left an indelible mark on how the Church addressed hidden transgressions. Established in the early 13th century to combat heresy, these ecclesiastical courts combined canon law with investigative rigor, witness testimony, scrutiny of written records, and examination of suspected sorcery. Though often portrayed as brutal, inquisitorial practice evolved over centuries into a more regulated process. By the mid-16th century, the tribunal at the Holy Office in Rome operated under detailed protocols codified by Pope Paul IV's Bull Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio 1559, which delineated rights of the accused, standards for evidence, and the necessity of episcopal oversight. Secret interrogations took place in secluded chambers where captains of the palace guard stood outside locked doors, ensuring confidentiality and preventing witness tampering. Torture, when authorized, followed strict guidelines. Pain enough to elicit confession but not irreparable harm, a regulation affirmed by Pope Innocent IV in the bull Ad Extirpanda, 1252. Yet beyond the headline-making spectacles in provincial courts, the Vatican's own tribunal relied heavily on penances, spiritual remedies, and reconciliation, reserving the harshest measures for repeat offenders, or those accused of conspiring against the papacy. Records from the archives reveal that during the Roman Inquisition under Pope Urban VIII, 1623-1644, over 60% of cases concluded with recantation and penance rather than imprisonment. Although the Holy Office was reformed and renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1965, its archival holdings still document these juridical rituals. Visiting scholars discover rows of registers, each volume bearing the seal of secrecy and the weight of human frailty. In that body of workwear, questions were whispered, and judgments rendered behind closed doors sees a ritual of control intertwined with mercy, a solemn reminder that institutional power often cloaks itself in the guise of spiritual protection. Within the Vatican's scholarly retreat, known as the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, a lesser-known circle of researchers once convened under the aegis of the Pope's prefect to explore esoteric manuscripts that lay beyond standard theological study. Founded formally in 1607 by Pope Paul V, the library housed not only canonical texts, but also collections of Greek and Arabic works on natural philosophy, astrology, and early sciences. Among its earliest scholars was Angelo Rocca, an Augustinian friar who in 1591 catalogued astrology commentaries attributed to the Persian astronomer al-Biruni, sparking debates on their compatibility with Christian doctrine. These scholars met secretly in the so-called Sala della Carte Rare, a dimly lit chamber where manuscripts on Hermetic philosophy and Kabbalistic thought were examined alongside biblical exegesis. The minutes of a 1,622 gathering, discovered in marginalia and unpublished until the 20th century, record that participants invoked the names of angels in Hebrew as part of their linguistic study-san act, viewed with suspicion by more conservative theologians. Yet rather than forbidden rituals, these sessions emphasized historical and linguistic analysis, seeking to understand how ancient peoples perceived the cosmos. When the Vatican's censorium intervened in 1654, it restricted access to certain volumes but allowed continued scholarly review under strict conditions. No copying of mystical symbols, and no public lectures on controversial content. Over time, the circle dissolved as the scientific revolution advanced, and the Church reassessed its relationship with early occult sciences. Today, the Vatican Library's Rare Books Reading Room opens by appointment only, preserving that legacy of guarded inquiry. While modern researchers focus on digitizing its holdings for broader access, the echo of those cloistered scholars remains a testament to the enduring tension between knowledge pursued in the light of faith and the mysteries best approached in whispered conversation. Beyond the gilded corridors of the public tours lies a subterranean network whispered to connect St. Peter's Basilica with basilicas and palaces across Roman intricate labyrinth of passageways, carved in the 1st century under Emperor Nero's Vatican Hill Palace. Rediscovered in 1940 during the construction of an air raid shelter, these tunnels, which snake beneath the Apostolic Palace, were once repurposed as escape routes for popes during medieval sieges. In 1274, after the traumatic conclusion of the Second Council of Lyons, Pope Gregory X ordered the renovation of these vaults, installing concealed doors and hidden stairways that led to the Leonine Wall and beyond. Vatican blueprint annotations from the 16th century show symbols marking these secret exits and chambers used for clandestine meetings of the Roman Curia. Some rooms feature narrow windows above ground level, enabling discreet observation of the city while safeguarding confidentiality. During Napoleon's occupation in 1798, papal sources recount that Cardinal Conclave used these tunnels to evade arrest and direct the Holy See's scattered diplomatic corps. Though subsequently sealed by Pope Pius VII in 1800 as a security measure, portions of the maze were excavated again in 1978 to celebrate the 11th centenary of Peter's burial, revealing fresco remnants that suggest private Eucharistic rites once took place there. Today, only a handful of Vatican engineers and ceremonial officials know the vault's full extent. Walking those cool, echoing passages, one imagines the hushed footsteps of cardinals and the hushed prayers of popes moving unseen beneath the living city. In that hidden underworld, walls carry silent witness to rites, performed far from the marble splendor above rituals that remind us the Vatican's most profound mysteries often lie beneath our feet. At the heart of every priestly calling lies the promise of obedience, a vow that extends beyond the public ceremonies and into an unspoken web of private commitments. While the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are publicly professed at ordination, deeper layers of promise bind select clergy to lifelong confidentiality and service. One such pledge, the Secretum Fidei, emerged in the 13th century among papal chaplains who guarded the Pope's private correspondence. Though never codified in the published pontifical, manuscripts dated to 1,285 record that newly appointed papal secretaries were required to swear an oath on a relic of Saint Gregory the Great, pledging never to divulge matters of conscience or political counsel. This vow extended beyond the seal of the confessional, encompassing diplomatic negotiations and doctrinal discussions held in the papal apartments. In the Renaissance, when the Vatican's political reach grew across Europe, ambassadors and nuncios swore similar secret oaths to safeguard sensitive intelligence on monarchs and councils. Though the Council of Trent, 1545, 1563, reaffirmed the seal of confession, it did not abolish these ancillary pledges, which persisted in private ceremonies conducted by the Camerlengo's office. Even today, when a new member is inducted into the papal household, whether as a chaplain of His Holiness or a member of the Pontifical Swiss Guard, takes a discreet vow of silence regarding internal deliberations, ceremonies, and security matters. This pledge, administered in a low tone within the confessio or a secluded cloister, underscores that obedience in Vatican service often involves secrets entrusted by faith and state alike. It is a reminder that behind the visible liturgy of public worship, a quieter liturgy of loyalty and discretion unfolds, sustaining the continuity and integrity of the Church's most private rituals. In the hushed chambers of private devotion, priests sometimes employ archaic Latin prayers that fall outside the standard liturgy, invoking the weight of centuries-old formulations to cloak their petitions in solemn mystery. These secret collects found in marginalia of manuscripts like the 15th century Pontificale Romanum and whispered in the Pope's private oratory often hark back to prayers used by early Church Fathers. For example, the Oratio Tenebrarum appears only in manuscripts copied under Pope Gregory I around 600 AD, invoking the god of shadows to protect the faithful from unseen dangers. Though never formally included in the Tridentine Missal of 1570, it survived in private breviaries passed among cathedral canons. In the 17th century, when Pope Urban VIII commissioned a revision of ceremonial texts, he expressly permitted certain ancient collects to remain in private use during votive masses, provided they were never recited aloud in public services. The prayer's archaic grammar and rare vocabulary words like umbra and penarius, used in unique theological sense censured that only clergy with specialized training could understand or recite it. Today, the current Roman ritual does not include these secret orations, yet vestiges endure in the Vatican's private chapel, where a senior papal sacristan maintains a leather-bound breviary containing these treasures. On occasions of grave need such as at the outbreak of World War II's, senior clergy silently chanted the Oratio Tenebrarum in Latin, believing its ancient cadence carried protective power. Though modern theology emphasizes transparent worship accessible to all, These shadow prayers remind us that beneath the open book of the Church's official worship, there lies a hidden shelf of verses reserved for moments when the faithful seek comfort in antiquity's whispered words. In the cloistered calm of monastic life, silence is more than the absence of speech. It is a ritual pathway to inner communion and, for some, a form of spiritual discipline that borders on the mystical. From the 4th century onward, desert fathers like Anthony the Great retreated from society into quiet solitude, believing that stillness revealed divine truths hidden by worldly noise. Their example inspired medieval monastic rules, most notably the Rule of Saint Benedict, promulgated in the 6th century, which mandated periods of strict silence, punctuated only by the chanting of psalms. By the 13th century, Roman contemplative orders such as the Carthusians adopted what they called the Great Silence, broken only at dawn and vespers, and monitored by a designated keeper of the silence, who both enforced and blessed those observances. In Vatican City, a modern echo of this practice persists within the Paul VI Audience Hall, where annual silent retreats for Vatican staff incorporate readings from early church hermits and extended periods of unspoken reflection. Archival notes from 1964 on the eve of Vatican II describe such a retreat held under Pope Paul VI's patronage, during which participants sat in complete silence for 3 days, punctuating meals with psalms and restoring ancient disciplines that had fallen into disuse. Though the council encouraged active participation in liturgy, it did not abolish private, silent observances, recognizing them as valid expressions of personal devotion. Today, when a novice enters the Vatican's Redemptoris Mater seminary, he vows to observe daily silence in designated hours, believing that in the hush of unvoiced prayer the soul can better discern God's whisper. Yet some critics warn that enforced silence can isolate as much as it illuminates, a reminder that the boundary between contemplative retreat and secretive withdrawal remains porous. In that tension where quiet offers both solace and secrecy, we glimpse how the Church has long balanced communal worship with the individual's search for God in the soundless depths of the human heart. When night falls over St. Peter's Square, the Swiss guards sworn to the pontiff's protection stand sentinel beneath the pale glow of lamps, their colorful halberds reflecting centuries of martial tradition. Less known, however, are the nocturnal rites this elite corps has historically observed away from prying eyes. As early as 1506, when Julius II recruited the first Swiss mercenaries to safeguard the Pope, veterans claimed that induction included a private ceremony in the Sala Regia Chapel. According to a handwritten account by Captain Jakob Meyer from 1588, new guards would kneel before a wooden statue of Saint Maurice, reciting a vow of loyalty in German as the chapel doors were locked, and the only light came from a single candle. This ritual mirrored medieval nightly investitures, blending Christian invocation with the solemnity of military oath-taking. By the 17th century, papal decrees under Urban VIII placed the guards directly under the Pope's command, and records indicate that their nightly watches began with a silent prayer offered by a chaplain in the crypt of the Vatican grottos, unseen by tourists on the marble floors above. Though modern Swiss guards undergo a public swearing-in ceremony on May 6 each year marking the sack of Rome in 1527, they still gather privately for a moment of reflection before taking up post at the Apostolic Palace. In recent times, a candlelit vigil in the Cascina Pio IV Gardens precedes every solemn papal departure, where guards recite Psalm 91 in Latin, asking for divine protection over both the pontiff and their own ranks. This blend of military precision and sacred ritual, preserved through meticulous guards' logs and passed down from captain to recruit, underscores a timeless conviction that service at the Vatican is as much a spiritual duty as it is a martial one. Hidden beneath the tiled pathways of the Vatican gardens lies a stone-lined corridor known among long-serving staff as the Papal Labyrinth. Though only a handful of Vatican guides ever mention it, church annals trace the network of walkways back to Pope Nicholas V's mid-15th century restoration of Hadrian's mausoleum. Originally designed as service tunnels for gardeners and stables, these corridors gained new purpose in 1605 when Pope Paul V commissioned their conversion into a processional route for secret investitures and midnight blessings. Documents in the fabric of St. Peter's archives describe how newly appointed masters of ceremonies would lead the Pope through this underworld, stopping at 7 chapels carved into the rockage, dedicated to a different mystery of the Rosary, before emerging at the grotto of Our Lady of Silence. During the turmoil of Napoleon's occupation in 1798, the labyrinth served as an escape path for prelates fleeing armed troops, its entrances concealed behind movable hedges and painted frescoes of saints. Though most tunnels were sealed by Pope Leo XIII in 1889 for structural safety, portions remain accessible for ceremonial rehearsals and emergency evacuation drills. Today, on the night before a pope's public coronation, the Master of Ceremonies leads the pontiff through the labyrinth's remaining arches in a private Way of Light ritual, reciting Latin antiphons and sprinkling holy water at each station. This quiet passage, undertaken by candlelight and shielded from the Vatican's grand plazas, underscores a dual purpose, ensuring both spiritual preparation and practical security. In that subterranean journey, the Pope walks a path trod by generations of predecessors, reaffirming that beneath the Church's visible grandeur lies a network of hidden rites designed to guide and protect its highest shepherd. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Since the Renaissance, the Vatican has maintained an observatory dedicated to the study of the heavens, affirming the belief that celestial patterns reveal God's design. In 1577, Pope Gregory XIII established the Tower of the Winds, equipping it with astrolabes and quadrants salvaged from classical observatories. Jesuit astronomers, including Christopher Clavius, who worked on the Gregorian calendar reform of 1580, toused these instruments to chart the sun and stars, interpreting their movements as divine order rather than mere fortune-telling. Nevertheless, astrology's lingering influence can be traced in the Vatican's ritual calendar. Feast days align with solstices and equinoxes, echoing earlier pagan festivals such as Saturnalia or Dionysia. Detailed records from the Collegium Romanum, preserved in the Vatican's secret archive, indicate that in the 17th century, the Pope received annual reports on planetary conjunctions, not to predict individual fates, but to assess cosmic influences on harvests and public health. In 1654, a papal bull under Pope Innocent X forbade clergy from consulting personal horoscopes, yet it upheld the observatory's work as a scholarly pursuit under church supervision. Modern Vatican astronomers at the Vatican Observatory Foundation in Castel Gandolfo focus on astrophysics rather than forecasts, yet they still mark the Vatican's feast of St. Albert, the great patron of scientists, in November 15, aligning with the rising of Sirius in mid-November, an ancient harbinger of abundance. When researchers today peer through the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope in Arizona, they continue a legacy that blends faith with scientific inquiry. In that fusion of ritual and reason, the Church acknowledges that wonder born from gazing at the stars can lead not to superstition, but to deeper awe of the Creator's vast and ordered cosmos. Deep in the heart of Vatican collections lies the Necrologium Aurelianum, a registry begun under Pope Hormisdas in 514 AD to commemorate the dead with annual masses. While public remembrance ceremonies occur in grand basilicas, the Necrologium records private requiem masses offered in secluded oratories for specific souls, founders, benefactors, and martyrs. These masses, conducted in near silence by a single priest, employ prayers drawn from ancient sacramentaries that predate the Gregorian sacramentary of the 8th century. The ritual begins with the ringing of a small silver bell 3 times, echoing medieval customs at burials, followed by the intonation of the Requiem Aeternam in an archaic tone once taught only to choir boys of the Schola Cantorum. Archival entries from 1243 describe how Pope Innocent IV ordered nightly masses for the recently deceased cardinals, each held in private chapels decorated with only black drapes and unlit candleless symbols of mourning that reflect pre-Christian funerary rites of the Roman Republic. Though Vatican II simplified funeral rites to emphasize communal participation, it did not eliminate these private commemorations. Today, the prefect of the papal household arranges for masses in the Pauline Chapel for those listed in the Necrologium, using the ancient collects inherited from the Galatian sacramentary. When a solitary priest celebrates the requiem for a name read silently from the ledger, he revives a ritual as intimate as it is timeless an act that binds the living to the dead in a sacred cycle of memory, prayer, and hope for resurrection. In the hush before daybreak, a select group of senior cardinals gathers near the Pauline Chapel for what is left unspoken as the Vigil of the Keys. Though unscheduled in public programs, Vatican logbooks dating to 1758 record that during times of political unrest cardinals met in secret for this rite. Each cardinal brings his own key to the papal apartment-san emblem of his authority and lays it before an altar draped in purple cloth. A low chant of the Pater Noster in Gregorian tone fills the shadows, interspersed with moments of silence as participants recall the weight of their office. The ritual concludes when the dean of the college blesses the keys with a prayer drawn from an unpublished mid-17th century manuscript, asking St. Peter to guard the church against schism and secular intrigue. Though the practice faded after the Lateran Treaty of 1929 restored the Vatican's sovereignty, whispers of the vigil persist in curial circles. Modern cardinals, facing global crises, still speak of renewing this vigil informalian act of solidarity that transcends protocol. In those unlit moments, as ancient keys glint in candlelight. The boundary between earthly governance and spiritual guardianship grows thin, reminding all who hold power that their true charge is to keep the barriers between church and chaos intact. Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Pauline Chapel, where Baroque frescoes depict scenes of apostolic glory, a singular ritual is whispered about among veteran liturgists, the so-called private Eucharist. Unlike the public Mass celebrated each morning in the Basilica's grand expanse, this sacrament is conferred in near solitary fashion for the Pope alone. Archival entries in the Vatican sacristy's ledger, dating to 1622 under Pope Gregory XV, note the commencement of a daily preparatory rite. As dawn's first light filters through stained glass, the master of ceremonies meticulously prepares 2 chalices containing the consecrated host reserved from the previous night's Mass, the other filled with newly blessed wine. The Pope, attended only by the papal sacristan and the personal chaplain, enters the chapel in silence, vesting in his white stole and subtly embroidered stole of gold thread. The private Eucharist follows the Roman canon verbatim, yet omits the litanies and congregational dialogues, allowing the pontiff to recite all prayers himself. After the consecration, he kneels before the altar, partakes of the host, and receives the precious blood from the chaplain, who then purifies the sacred vessels without breaking the hush. Historical notes reveal that during the turbulence of the Napoleonic invasions, Pope Pius VII relied on this intimate rite to fortify his resolve, each private communion becoming both an act of devotion and a bulwark against political despair. While Vatican II's liturgical reforms emphasized communal participation and discouraged reserving the Eucharist for isolated practice, they nonetheless respected established papal customs, allowing the private Eucharist to continue under the rubric of personal devotion. Today, after offering the public Mass, the Pope may slip away to the Pauline Chapel, where this age-old sacrament unfolds in almost complete obscurity, a poignant reminder that even the highest office in Christendom sometimes seeks solace in solitary encounter with the mystery of the Eucharist. In the tapestry of Catholic sacraments, 7 hold official status, yet whispers persist of a hidden 5th rite, reserved for the Pope, and his closest advisors saw a ritual of private absolution said to transcend the public sacrament of confession. Though no official document names this rite, references appear in the private registers of the Apostolic Penitentiary, the tribunal responsible for matters of conscience, dating back to the pontificate of Pope Urban VIII in the early 17th century. According to these entries, on the eve of major ecclesiastical councils or during crises of doctrine, the pontiff would convene a small assembly of penitentiaries and chamberlains in the Pauline Chapel. There, in the flicker of candlelight, he would recite a series of confessional prayers drawn from ancient penitential texts, predating Charlemagne's 7th century reforms, emphasizing contrition's fruits, and an intense plea for divine mercy that extended beyond the general absolution offered to crowds. This private service culminated in a laying on of hands by the major penitentiary, symbolically transferring Peter's authority to forgive sins directly from the tomb of the apostle in the crypt below. Though the Council of Trent codified the sacrament of penance in 1547 and prohibited unauthorized rites, it did not address this papal custom which continued discreetly through the 19th century. When tensions rose over the modernist crisis under Pope Pius X, he reportedly used this secret absolution to strengthen his resolve against dissenting theologians. Today, while the general absolution given during Jubilee years welcomes multitudes, the pontiff's private confession remains a personal devotion exercised in the office of the penitentiary, reaffirming that even the visible church contains depths known only to its highest shepherds. This fifth rite, shrouded in ritual and secrecy, reminds us that within institutional liturgy lies a deeper current of spiritual care, reserved for those who bear the heaviest burdens of faith. At the end of a pope's earthly journey, the Church unfolds a sequence of rites distinct from any other funeral, a final ordination of the pontiff into eternal life. When Pope Pius XII died in 1958, the protocols observed echoed procedures first codified under Pope Urban V in the 14th century, though their roots extend to early Christian burial customs. Immediately upon death, the camerlengo enters the Pope's private apartments, removes the fisherman's ring in a ceremony witnessed only by the papal sacristan and 2 masters of ceremonies, and strikes it 3 times with a silver hammer, declaring, "The successor of St. Peter is dead." The ring is then smashed, symbolizing the end of the pontificate. The Pope's body remains in repose for 3 days in the Clementine Hall, draped in a simple white mozzetta rather than full papal vestments, recalling the humility of St. Peter's martyrdom. During this vigil, the Te Deum hymn is replaced by the Requiem chant, its somber tone marking the transition from earthly reign to heavenly hope. On the 3rd evening, the body is transferred into the basilica's nave in a candlelit procession, accompanied by 12 cardinals chanting the Litany of the Saints and carrying the papal coffin of privilege reserved for the successor's nearest advisors. The funeral mass, celebrated at the altar of the chair, omits the papal tiara and replaces it with the standard mitre, signifying the Church's continuity beyond any single reign. Finally, the coffin is lowered into the grottos beneath St. Peter's Confessio, where the new pope will later stand. This last rite of the successor blends rites of coronation in reverse order vesting in white stole, becomes stripping to humility, and serves as a poignant reminder that even the highest shepherd returns to the common fold. The Church's history sealed by prayer, ritual, and the promise of resurrection. Rituals cloaked in secrecy often invite the curious and the conspiratorial alike, morphing solemn ceremonies into sensational tales. The journey from guarded practice to fringe myth typically begins when an event, say, a private blessing or a conclave oath, occurs behind closed doors. Lacking first-hand witnesses, observers rely on rumor and rumor on imagination, a transformation fueled by sensationalist pamphlets in the 16th century and by pamphleteers during the French Revolution, who claimed the Pope secretly sold indulgences in back rooms. The invention of the printing press magnified these stories, allowing exaggerated accounts of Vatican orgies or satanic masses to spread across Europe in multiple languages. In the 20th century, anti-clerical journalists further embellished tales of hidden vaults and occult texts, conflating true archival restrictions with nefarious intent. Modern social media accelerates this process. A single, out-of-context photograph of a cardinal's vestment or a misinterpreted Latin prayer can ignite global speculation overnight. Yet historians and Vatican archivists emphasize that most secret rites serve purely pastoral or administrative functions, not esoteric agendas. The phenomenon of ritual rumor showcases how lack of transparency feeds suspicion, turning legitimate traditions into catalysts for conspiracy. When scholars publish corrective research detailing the genuine origins of secret collects or the structural necessity of subterranean tunnels, their findings often fail to penetrate the echo chambers of sensationalist forums. Thus, the Church faces a paradox. Preserving certain intimate rituals reinforces continuity and devotion, yet secrecy also invites distortion. In charting this path from ritual to rumor, we see how human imagination bridges gaps in knowledge, weaving stories that reveal as much about our thirst for mystery as about the rites themselves. In the hush that follows revelation, we stand at the threshold between light and shadow, questioning which rituals belong in daylight and which are best left veiled. The Vatican's panorama of rites from public processions in St. Peter's Square to the private Eucharist in the Pauline Chapel reflects a living tradition that alternates between openness and guarded mystery. Public liturgies unite millions in shared prayer, their texts and ceremonies published in multiple languages after Vatican II to foster participation and understanding. Private rites, however, serve as sanctuaries for the soul's deeper longings. The Secretum Fidei, pledge of papal chaplains, the midnight vigil of the keys among cardinals, the silent collecta tenebrarum, murmured in clandestine chapels. Some of these practices endure because they nurture spiritual intimacy. Others survive as historical vestiges, their original purposes obscured by time. In each case, the boundary between communal and concealed reflects a balance the Church has struck for 2 millennia: the need to proclaim the gospel in light and the need to safeguard certain mysteries in shadow. As we've traced these rituals' origins, Jewish incense rites, Constantine's processions, medieval inquisitions, and Renaissance alchemical inquiries, we recognize that mystery itself has ritualized form. Today, when you hear the first puff of smoke from the Sistine Chapel chimney or glimpse a cardinal slip behind a locked door, remember that you witness only half the story. The other half unfolds in silence, guided by devotion and discretion. In embracing both transparency and veil, the Vatican crafts a tapestry of faith that honors tradition while inviting wonder. Let us carry this understanding forward, appreciating that some doors open to the visible feast of faith, while others conceal rooms where the Spirit meets its sovereign in sacred secrecy. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.